Hello, everyone. My name is Mary. Let me tell you my unusual story, whether I was right or not. In general, since my childhood, I was an ordinary child. I didn't differ from my other peers. Everything would be fine, but one day when I came home from school, I saw my parents. In fact, they should be at work at that time. Their faces were agitated. It really scared me. I immediately went to them and find out what happened. My father said we should all go to a friend's house together. The friend's name was James. Unsuspecting, I agreed. Soon we found ourselves in an office. It's strange that we visit a friend at his work. When he started the conversation, he kept looking at me, asked how we were doing in the family. Is nothing unusual happening? I knew it wasn't just that. Then he asked me if I noticed any strange things in my life lately, but it was still the same as usual. Later I find out that this was not a friend of my father, but a psychologist. But why and for whom this appointment? I didn't understand. Our conversation was quiet. In a moment, I noticed that James was looking at me with an unusual look. You could even say demonic look. His eyes were bright red, and his brows were furrowed like the devil. This scared me very much, and I tried to ignore it. After the conversation, we drove home in silence. Everyone thought about their own things, and I was not happy because it seemed like my parents had cheated me about the psychiatrist. That seemed to be the end of it. I also continued to go to school and do my own things. But no, on the next day, when I came home from school, I saw the psychiatrist at our house. They were talking about something. When James saw me, he smiled maliciously. His eyes were still red. I noticed fangs and teeth, like he looked like a vampire. I got scared and yelled at him, "Get out of the house, you devil!" and ran quickly to the room and locked myself in. My parents ran after me. They were calling for me and shouting for me to open the door. It wasn't like them. They had never even raised their voices to me before. I was scared. I crawled under the bed. Mom began pounding viciously and harder and more furiously, and Father laughed in the background. It seemed that the door was about to break. I gathered my courage and quickly jumped out under the bed, and I jumped out of the window and ran quickly away from the house. In shock, I didn't even notice that I had already run for several miles. Sitting down to catch my breath, I began to think about what really happened. There were different options in my head, and only one thought kept repeating itself. That this psychiatrist was actually a devil in the guise of a man. And he wanted to ruin our perfect family. It was like an epiphany. I hated James very much, and the plan matured. I had to make sure that the psychiatrist has disappeared from our family. After thinking it over and calming down, I went home. I had to walk for a long time and returned only in the evening. When my parents were already asleep, I went quietly to my room and fell asleep. I woke up from the fact that my mother woke me up. My father and my psychiatrist, James, were also in the room. They all had red eyes and were laughing maliciously, and the appearance of the psychiatrist changed at times to the devil. He was wearing a black cloak and big horns. Sharp, bloody fangs protruded from his mouth. I broke away from my mother and ran to the kitchen. She grabbed a knife and tried to stab James. But just as my father grabbed my arm and pulled me back, I lost my balance and fell to the floor and lost consciousness. I didn't wake up until morning in the hospital. I saw 3 men in white coats standing over me. I couldn't move because my hands and feet were tied, and her mouth was taped shut, probably to keep her from screaming. One of them took out a syringe and gave me an injection. After that, everything began to blur around me and make me sleepy. Falling asleep, I saw the silhouette of the devil on the wall. I don't know how long I slept. When I woke up, I saw my mom and dad. She sat next to me on the bed and looked at me anxiously. When I came to myself, I thought it was over, and James won't bother us again. Later, the doctor came and said that I have schizophrenia. I couldn't believe it. This can't be happening, especially with me. And in addition to this, I have learned that I often scream in my sleep lately. But I didn't believe the doctor. I felt quite well, and with the exception of recent events, I didn't notice anything unusual. But the doctor still prescribed some pills and ordered a trip to the psychiatrist who was in the same hospital. He called him in to introduce me. This psychiatrist turned out to be quite a good and solid person. He asked me if I was feeling all right. He seemed quite a nice man. But in an instant, I saw his eyes flash red.
Hi everyone, I'm Riley, and I want to tell you about my unusual business, which was promoted in a few months. To tell the truth, my services are successful, and the most interesting thing is that I am only 16 years old. I am already a successful novice businessman. Do you want the story of a startup? Then watch, comment, like, and share this video. It all started quite spontaneously. My family and I once went to spend the summer with my grandparents in the countryside. They don't like bustle. When they were both 60 years old, they began to think about living in the country, closer to nature. Then my parents bought them a small but cool house near the city park. This way they could walk there all day, and they also got a dog to entertain them in the evenings. On the way to the old people's house, I asked my parents what would happen when they got old. My mother laughed and said that she really wanted to babysit her grandchildren, also live outside the city, get a dog, and enjoy old age with my father. It was a good prospect. And then I asked what my grandparents would do if they didn't have grandchildren. The father said that every old man dreams of holding his child's child in his hands, because only grandchildren can be sweeter than their children. And suddenly, I thought about those who didn't get the chance. Not all people have a family. When we arrived, my grandparents ran out into the street, a smile on their face. They kissed me and my little sister, and then took us home. I loved this moment. My grandmother made her brand casserole, a pie with nuts and caramel, made fresh orange juice, and it was all for us. Her table was always full of food in honor of our arrival. We had a very cool vacation with them, played with the dog, went to the park, rode horses near the house. This is what it means to be a guest of your grandparents. A couple of days later, at dinner, when the adults were talking to each other, I heard Stacy's name. I remember this girl. We used to live next door. She didn't have any grandparents, and she was always surprised when I told her how cool it was. Suddenly, I was reminded of the subject of lonely old men again. I asked my grandfather, "Imagine if you didn't have grandchildren. Would you be very upset?" My grandfather replied that he would, because there was nothing worse than facing old age alone. After spending a few luxurious days there, we had to go back to the city and do our usual things. A week later, my grandmother called us and said that my grandfather was very ill. My parents were alarmed, and we went there again. Dad insisted on taking the old people to us for treatment, so they temporarily decided to live with us. Since my parents worked, I went with my grandparents to hospitals, sometimes called the doctor at home. My sister, even if somehow, but cooked our food and cleaned the old people's bedroom. When my grandfather got better, he said that God gave him wonderful grandchildren. It was nice to hear that, and I thought again about lonely old people. I didn't get much sleep that night, so I went to Instagram and deliberately found Stacy. She grew up to be a very beautiful girl. I texted her, she was online, and immediately responded. She recognized me too. Word by word, we started talking. I found out that when we were 10 years old, her parents went with her to another city. The reason for this was her grandparents. I didn't understand her offer because I remembered that she just never had any. I thought there weren't any until I accidentally found out about it. It turns out that my parents do not communicate with them almost since my birth. They live in a nursing home where my parents do not go. And they told me that my grandparents died before I was born, she said. It was terrible. But the worst thing is that it turns out that Stacy, having learned about the existence of old men, decided to find them. She found out the address and went there alone, found them by their last name, and said she was their granddaughter. Stacy was shocked by the conditions in which people lived. In fact, there are a lot more abandoned old people than we thought. All of them walk on closed territory, live as if in a prison. Food, walks, and sleep on a schedule. Pills, TV, and shower, the only variety. While she was telling me this, I felt sick. I thought it would be a good idea to replace these old people's homes with something better, like my old people's homes. Stacy spent most of the day there with her relatives and realized that her relatives were awesome. She began to visit them often, and when her parents found out about it, there was an incident and they moved again. From that moment on, Stacy constantly thinks about those who were abandoned. At that moment, I had an idea. I suggested that she help the elderly. "How's that?" she asked. And everything was simple. There are retired people who live in their own homes, like mine, for example. Such people are extremely lacking in communication with young children. In addition, they often need help to move something, cook, and so on. We could be their grandchildren for a while. At first, the idea was based on enthusiasm. Stacy organized this kind of work in her city, and I am in mine. In the evening, we reported who visited how many houses. To tell you the truth, I had a long list of addresses. It took time to get around to each one, which is a good thing I had a summer vacation. Taking into account the fact that I came to every house, helped to do things, went instead to shops, pharmacies, walked dogs, washed cars, it took me 1 day for 2 houses. It wasn't enough, but I tried. I remember coming to the first house. Old Mrs. Ruby lived there. She also had a small house, in which she had long ago built a mini garden. It was overgrown with grass, and some of the house's doorknobs and furniture were broken, and it was a mess. I went inside, introduced myself, and identified myself as a volunteer assistant. At first they looked at me askance, thinking I was some kind of cheater, but when they were convinced of my pure intentions, Mrs. Ruby said what I could do to help her. I did everything right, and she gave me a delicious berry juice and chocolate cookies. When she heard about my initiative, she was happy and said that it would be great if I didn't stop there. I don't have my own grandchildren, and my children are far away. They have long left and can't come even once a year, so I live alone. They help me with money, but I can't do much anymore, she said, and shoved $10 into my hands. That's how I made my first money. When I got home, I told Stacy about the payment, and she suggested that I seriously consider volunteering as a business. Why not? We cannot take money from those who do not have it at all, but take it from those who give. This way, we will cover the expenses that are causing us to go into negative territory, she said. I consulted with my parents, and they said that this plan might work. I created pages in social networks, made ads, and ordered business cards. Of course, not everything was smooth. There were cases when I came to any house where harmful retired people did nothing but vent their anger. One of them even had a heart attack, so it's good that I called an ambulance on time and they saved her. But in general, the work was going on in my city, Stacy in hers. We called our services Grandson for an Hour, officially registered, took first aid courses, received a work permit, studied a basic course of psychological assistance, communicated more and more with the elders, and I realized that they most needed a company, someone to talk to and have fun with. A year later, we decided to expand the staff, recruit people, and also ran them through all the training materials. You won't believe it, but we had a lot of demand. People who have elderly parents, relatives, grandparents who are alone without supervision but who need help, called us and wrote to us. We kept a written record of addresses, names with photos, so it was easier to remember who it is and what kind of approach to it is needed. Because we covered 2 cities at the same time, the ads spread quickly. In the end, Stacy and I became the main managers. We only took calls, messages, and controlled the case from home. Our employees came to the old people sometimes just to calm them down, listen to what was painful, give advice, sometimes read or watch a movie together. Isn't that a bad thing? However, there are also disadvantages. Once, when all my fellow employees were busy, I took the call myself and went to the specified address. It turned out that there was a grandfather, very old. He sat alone on the porch, clutching a black and white photo. When he saw me, he showed it to me and said it was his beautiful wife who was dead. He wanted to go to her. I asked him how I could help, and he said he wanted to ask me to bury him like my own grandfather, because he was lonely. My heart sank at that moment. I was so hurt for him. I tried to amuse him, to cheer him up, to offer to have dinner with me and go for a walk, but he hugged me and said he wanted to sleep. I put him to bed and went to the kitchen to make tea. When I got back, he wasn't breathing. I kept my word and buried him as my own. My only regret was that he didn't call me sooner. I might have changed his fate, and he would have lived for a while longer. You know, on the one hand, I'm glad that my business is thriving, but on the other hand, I see that the more people call me about an order, the more lonely people there are.